Okay, so today's talk will be given by Dr. Gilah Kletenik. The talk is entitled Serves No Purpose, Spinoza's Denaturalization of Sovereignty. So after Dr. Kletenik finishes speaking, maybe 45 minutes, we look forward to taking questions. And if you are joining us via Zoom, please enter your questions, if you have them, in the chat. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gilah Kletenik, our postdoctoral associate at the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies at Boston University. Before she joined us here, she was the Alan M. Struck Fellow at the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University. She received her PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies from New York University in 2020. We're very pleased to announce that Dr. Kletenik has been reappointed at the Elie Wiesel Center's postdoctoral as the Elie Wiesel Center's postdoctoral associate, and will therefore join us for an additional academic year. On her approach to teaching, Dr. Kletenik states, "It's important to create a safe space where students can ask and challenge, and where there is no expectation that they believe or think a certain way." Kletenik's approach to philosophy is similarly both challenging and open to challenge, as can be seen in her work on Spinoza, which frames his philosophy as advancing a critique of the mutually reinforcing sovereignties that secure our grasp of reality, the promise of reason, and the status of humans. Dr. Kletenik is completing her book manuscript, Sovereignty Disrupted, Spinoza and the Disparity of Reality, which I personally am eager to read. It is our good fortune that she is here presenting some of that very research here today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gilah Kletenik.
Thank you, Ingrid, for that lovely introduction. And it's lovely to see everyone here in the flesh and everybody on Zoom. Lovely to see you as well. All right, Spinoza, our Dutch Jewish philosopher born in 1632 in Amsterdam. The reception of Spinoza's philosophy has been controversial, to say the least, since his own times. Pertinent to our exploration is the problematic ways in which he's often portrayed in the scholarship. Aside from the panoply of contradictory positions often ascribed to Spinoza, his beliefs tend to be whatever a given interpreter has decided they are, there's another problematic trend in the history of Spinoza's reception that receives far less attention, and that's his Jewishness, or the Jewishness of his thought. On the one hand, for some, especially the German idealists, chief amongst them Hegel, Spinoza's thinking is reducible to his Jewishness. As Hegel has it, Spinoza's thought is essentially a reprisal of Oriental identity. Because Spinoza is a Jew, his philosophy is perforce an echo from Eastern lands. To Hegel, and I quote, "Spinoza's philosophy is lacking because it does not have the Western principle of individuality." Spinozism, for Hegel, is a moment in the history of philosophy to be absorbed and overcome by his grand history, his grand Western project. Thusly, Hegel enacts a teleological supersession of Spinoza. On the other hand, today, in both continental philosophy and in more Anglo-analytic circles, Spinoza's Jewishness is almost invisible, which is to say that his philosophy is routinely presented in terms of how it does or does not comport with the hegemonic Western Christian canon. Is Spinoza a Cartesian or an anti-Cartesian? Is his political thought Hobbesian or not so Hobbesian? Well, these are reasonable lines of inquiry. Their position of privilege, the command that they carry in the discourse, erases the fount of non-Christian, non-Western philosophers whose thinking profoundly informed Spinoza's. Many of Spinoza's most innovative ideas are extensions of or influenced by an alternative philosophical tradition that's been programmatically marginalized by Western thought, Jewish and Islamic medieval philosophy. Spinoza is indebted to the more naturalist or materialist interpretation of Aristotle propagated by Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and others that reached Spinoza refracted through Jewish thinkers like Maimonides, Gersonides, and Crescus. Spinoza was also exposed to certain ideas in Kabbalah. Ignoring these sources and Spinoza's critical divergences from them, which often happens, misses so much of Spinoza's project. That said, it's imperative that we not reduce Spinoza to his Jewishness. This is a regrettable misstep that certain exegetes, particularly those in Jewish philosophy, tend to commit. All of this is to say that Spinoza is an original and unconventional thinker who, like most thinkers, is informed by those he reads and at the same time remains irreducible to them. To decolonize Spinoza's studies, and here I use the term metaphorically, is to recuperate these repressed influences, to be attuned to these ways of thinking that are non-Western, non-Christian, non-Latin. We'll be registering precisely such resonances in our time together. Our itinerary commences by reprising the basic tenets of Spinoza's ontology. This will prepare us to explore his critiques of transcendence, anthropocentrism, and teleology. We'll analyze their significance and appraise the rationales of supremacy that sponsor them. Throughout, we'll note the salience of Spinoza's critique for making sense of our present moment, specifically climate emergencies, the invasion of Ukraine, and the pandemic. What is? This is the question of ontology, the attempt to grasp the nature of reality. Spinoza's entire philosophy is grounded in his ontology. His most generative contributions center on his assertions about reality and their epistemological and ethical implications. So what does Spinoza tell us about reality? Let's remind ourselves. For Spinoza, what exists is substance or God or nature. Now, what substance? Substance is the infinite power of existing. It's not actually a thing or a being. Rather, substance is power, a power that's never in potential, it's only ever actualized. Reality or substance is infinite existence. By infinity, Spinoza means unlimited. Nothing contains, constrains, or controls it. If it did, this would suggest that there's something more powerful than substance, something other to it, something that substance lacks. Imbricated with this commitment to infinity is Spinoza's signature notion of imminence. Because reality is infinite, it's limitless. There can be nothing outside or beyond it. Because that would mean, obviously, that substance lacks something. Everything, therefore, is of substance. And substance is a causa immanens, an immanent cause of all that is. Everything that exists is of substance and inheres in it. You, me, this computer, the air we're breathing, we're all modes of substance, which are the countless ways in which the infinite power that is substance is actualized. We're all participants in what Spinoza calls the infinite connection of causes, which is an immanent matrix of inter and intra connection. With these ideas, Spinoza introduces a radical conception of reality. What exists is infinite, and consequently, it's immanent. Why are these concepts of infinity and immanence so significant? Partly because of the alternative understandings of reality that they contest. Part one of the Ethics incrementally dismantles what I call the logics of sovereignty that subsidize competing approaches to reality. Spinoza's ontology, as we'll see, disrupts sovereign traits such as transcendence, supremacy, atomistic individualism, and absolute freedom. All of these are familiar staples of predominant Western approaches to reality. For Spinoza, what exists is not the product of a being that's transcendent, other to reality. Rather, infinity requires that there's nothing that isn't of substance, There's no outside, no above, no beyond. All that exists, inheres in substance, is of substance. With this imminence, I suggest, Spinoza's not only dethroning the traditional conception of a transcendent God that's supreme over reality, he's also divesting reality itself, substance, nature, all that is, of the sovereign traits conventionally accorded to God. This is why Spinoza's ontology is not an ontotheology. Ontotheology is the term that Heidegger, borrowing from Kant, uses to describe the ways in which Western metaphysics relies upon certain theological ideas to make sense of reality. Against this tendency, Spinoza arrays an ontology that doesn't reproduce the theological constructs that it critiques. This is critical because all too often, certain thinkers, especially modern thinkers, might dispense with God only to repurpose the traits traditionally associated with God by transposing them onto nature as a whole or onto particular beings, most often humans. For example, for many thinkers, there may no longer be a sovereign God, but the human individual becomes sovereign. Though nature may no longer be taken as directed by a transcendent God, for some, nature is instead regulated by transcendent natural laws. Spinoza's feat is that he skirts this common mistake. He deposes the sovereign God, but doesn't recycle its accoutrements of sovereignty. On the contrary, Spinoza's imminence and infinity combine to reject any force that comprises what he calls a dominion within a dominion. All right, now all of this is by way of introduction. We're now primed to limn our primary text, Spinoza's appendix to part 1 of his Ethics. And this appendix is really a gift to its readers because he essentially reprises all the arguments he took so much time unfurling throughout part 1, and he also, lucky for us, does it candidly and with polemical punch. Now there's so much to explore in the appendix, we're going to focus on several interconnected concepts: teleology and purposiveness, anthropocentrism and human exceptionalism, and so-called normativity or laws of nature. In this appendix, and this is what's so wonderful about it, Spinoza doesn't only identify and dismantle a constellation of misconceptions that people have about reality, but he unpacks the causes of these misconceptions. Louis Althusser is therefore right in discerning in Spinoza's appendix the matrix of every possible theory of ideology. Let's take a look. The appendix opens. All the prejudices I here undertake to expose depend on this one, that humans commonly suppose that all natural things act as humans do on account of an end. Indeed, they maintain as certain that God itself directs all things to some certain end. For they say that God has made all things for human, and human that he might worship God. Nature has no set end before it, and all final causes are nothing but human fiction. The prejudice that Spinoza endeavors to disprove is the misbelief that nature, reality, acts towards an end, that it has a telos. That what exists or what happens is subsumed under or subordinated to a goal, that there's an order undergirding nature. Why is it that people believe that nature has an end? Because humans often act on account of an end. So they suppose nature must too. Nature must also have a plan and a purpose like we often do. And here we encounter the trap of anthropocentrism. Teleology starts with humans imposing their sense of themselves onto reality, and correlatively presuming that reality centers on them, acts towards their benefit. The epistemic problem here is thus twofold. One, how humans see themselves is mistaken, and two, how they see reality is accordingly misguided. Humans, Spinoza tells us, think themselves free because they are conscious of their volitions and their appetites and do not think, even in their dreams, of the causes by which they're disposed to wanting and willing, because they're ignorant of these causes. Think themselves free. Here, Spinoza gestures towards his acclaimed rejection of Cartesianism. Descartes and others, Spinoza writes, treat humans' way of living not of natural things, but of those things outside nature. Indeed, they seem to conceive human as a dominion within a dominion, for they believe that human disturbs rather than follows the order of nature, that human has absolute power over his actions, and that he's determined only by himself. For Spinoza, there's no free decision of the mind. Elsewhere, and I love how he says it, those who believe that they either speak or remain silent or do anything from a free decision of the mind are dreaming with their eyes open. So basically, anything I say today, I can't really be blamed for it. The problem with free will is that it rests upon transcendence and exceptionalism, that humans are exempt from natural causation, that our thoughts and actions are not causally determined, but rather sovereignly commanded by a mind that transcends the body. By segregating humans from their bodies and securing the transcendence of the cogito, Descartes joins a tradition that seeks to free humans from nature, to render them exceptional. With this, he consummates a trajectory of dualism that commences with Plato and is secured by Augustine, for whom nature is matter and will is spirit. Humans, created in the image of God, are endowed, like God, with a transcendent, independent will. By bestowing free will upon humans, Descartes positions them as superior to other beings, erecting a hierarchy within nature. It's no surprise, then, that Descartes describes his own project as endeavoring, quote, to make ourselves, as it were, lords and masters of nature. Spinoza's Jewish naturalism is diametrically opposed to this Christian Cartesian picture. Whereas Descartes' dualism emerges from a tradition of Christian voluntarism and denigration of the body, Spinoza's alternative is indebted to the rationalism of Islamic Aristotelianism, especially as expressed in Falsafa. Spinoza's Jewish and Islamic predecessors were comparatively far more comfortable in placing humans in nature. For them, freedom is not escape from nature. Rather, any sense of freedom is only ever political and ethical. It's never metaphysical. Instead of sequestering humans from nature, Spinoza insists that humans, like all modes, are participants in the infinite connection of causes and subject to its ways. Deleuze is therefore right to describe Spinoza's ontology as inducting, quote, an equality of being. There's no natural hierarchy in reality. All beings, all modes are equally of the infinite connection of causes. Crucially, Spinoza's imminence pressures the Western binary erected between nature and culture. How do I mean? Since humans are of nature, not other to it, it makes no sense to dichotomously segregate humans or human affairs from what purportedly lies beyond it. There's no other to nature, no boundaries to demarcate it. In place of this type of segregation, Spinoza permits us to think reality in terms of integration. The infinite connection of causes acts through what he calls agreements and disagreements, coherences and adaptations. There's no binary between humans and the natural world. What this means is that it makes no sense to think of humans as in relation to nature, as if we're subjects over and against an object, nature. It's precisely this binary and its purport to exceptionalism that continues to license human supremacy over nature, authorizing our plunder of it. But there's more here. Imminence also means that it's misguided to speak of harmony or disharmony with nature, continuity or discontinuity with nature. These precise binaries continue to structure so much of the discourse surrounding our climate emergencies in a manner that only reaffirms human exceptionalism. I'd also allow that Spinozist imminence undermines the enduring binary of that which is natural and that which is artificial. But we'll save that for another time. For now, let's return to our appendix. Anthropocentrism rests upon conceits of human exceptionalism, which in turn condition the notion that nature serves a purpose. It acts towards an end. These convictions don't come from nowhere. For Spinoza, everything always has a cause. And the cause of these misbeliefs, according to Spinoza, is that looking around reality, nature, there really are things that benefit us. As Spinoza lists eyes for seeing, sun for light, plants and animals for consumption, we really do benefit from what surrounds us, from what we are a part of. The problem is that we see this and deduce from these actualities that therefore all of nature is meant to serve us. Hence, they consider all natural things as a means to their own advantage. What more, for after they had considered things as means, they could not believe that things had made themselves. But from the means they were accustomed to prepare for themselves, they had to infer that there was a ruler or a number of rulers of nature endowed with human freedom who had taken care of all things for them and made all things for their use. And since they had never heard anything about the temperament of these rulers, they had to judge it from their own. Anthropocentrism begets anthropomorphism and underwrites teleology. Humans see reality and can't imagine that it made itself. It must be that there's a creator, a ruler. But what's the nature of this ruler of everything? It must be like ours. It must be endowed with the freedom that we fictitiously ascribe to ourselves. It must be sovereign just like our sovereigns. This circular reasoning effectively naturalizes sovereignty. It makes the human fabrication of sovereignty seem natural, which in turn justifies that very human construct of sovereignty. To secure the human purport of being exceptional and distinct from nature, humans reflect their social construction of a ruler onto nature, imagining the sovereign as likewise distinct and exceptional. Paradoxically, though, this sovereign is considered supreme over all, and yet it's simultaneously seen as subservient to the telos of human satisfaction. But there's more here. This creation of a sovereign God in the human image engenders an entire web of reinforcing fictions of sovereignty. How so? Hence, they maintain that God directs all things for the use of humans in order to bind humans to them and be held by humans in the highest honor. So it happens that each of them has thought up from his own temperament different ways of worshiping God, so that God might love them above all the rest and direct the whole of nature according to the needs of their blind desire and insatiable greed. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Anthropocentrism inscribes a hierarchy wherein human modes reign supreme over non-human modes. But more than that, Spinoza tells us, it also fosters conflict between humans. The logic of exceptionalism begets entangled ideologies of domination, right? Sovereignty is infectious. Once it's there, it spawns ever more forms of supremacy. And spoiler alert, sovereignty benefits those already in power. What a surprise. But I love this because we see a little personal, surely coming from Spinoza's own experience. Hence it appears that those who seek the true causes of miracles, and is eager like an educated man to understand natural things, not to wonder at them like a fool, is generally considered and denounced as an impious heretic by those whom the people honor as interpreters of nature and the gods. For they know that if ignorance is taken away, then foolish wonder, the only means they have of arguing and defending their authority, is also taken away. The installation of a sovereign over nature naturalizes supremacy and validates systems of domination that already exist amongst humans. It's not just that how we perceive reality is socially constructed, right? But precisely the formulations that gain traction are those that reinforce the dominant structures of power. It's not out of nowhere that Marx, a reader of Spinoza, reminds us that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. Spinoza beats him to it. But let's take a step back for a moment to consider what so troubles Spinoza about teleology and purposiveness. What's the big deal? It contravenes infinity, that tenet of Spinoza's entire ontology and system, in two significant ways. First, by curtailing the perfection of substance. As Spinoza writes, if God acts for the sake of an end, he necessarily wants something which he lacks. If substance is infinite, he cannot want for anything, right? Substance can't want for anything if it's infinite. And second, teleology, Spinoza writes, places something outside God, which does not depend on God, to which God attends, as a model in what he does and at which he aims, as at a certain goal, suggesting that there's something other to nature to which God must yield. But infinity precludes precisely such transcendence. There's more here. Teleology relies upon the logics of sovereignty. What exists is subordinated to a telos, a purpose, or plan. Back to our appendix. And because those who do not understand the nature of things, but only imagine them, affirm nothing concerning things, and take the imagination for the intellect, they firmly believe in their ignorance of things and of their own nature that there is an order in things. And since those things we can easily imagine are especially pleasing to us, humans prefer order to confusion, as if order were anything in nature more than a relation to our imagination. Humans have been so mad as to believe that God is pleased by harmony. Indeed, there are philosophers who have persuaded themselves that the motions of the heavens produce a harmony. We humans love order, or at least some of us do. Ask anybody who's ever lived with me. I love order. It makes life smoother, more convenient, clean. So we look at reality and imagine that it too has order. But to see order in reality is to presuppose transcendence, right? Either a transcendent God who orders nature or a transcendent ordering force in nature. Either option, Spinoza tells us, undercuts infinity and imminence. The predilection for order makes sense. It's comforting and stabilizing to imagine that reality is organized as opposed to accepting the really harsh truth that it lacks system, structure, and standard. The presupposition of order is anthropocentric. It presumes that reality is as we humans want it to be, or as satisfies our desires, rather than how it actually is. This rationale is familiar to many of us from certain ideologies of progress. Claims that reality marches ever forward, that it bends towards a telos, that history is advancing. I've recently been thinking a lot about this, particularly this neoliberal or liberal ideology of progress in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. The surprise that so many, especially Western diplomats, experts, scholars of the region had when Putin actually invaded Ukraine, despite comprehensive intelligence warnings that this was actually his intention, bespeaks our collective attachment to progress. The belief that inevitably what we want, democracy and freedom, would reign supreme. That these must, as if there's some guarantor above or beyond securing these wishes of ours. The danger of such hope and hopism in progress, of course, is that it prevents us from registering all the evidence to the contrary. All the indications, for example, that fascism, nationalism, and a certain traditionalism have never disappeared, and that they've been especially ascendant these past many years. We've had a brutal awakening here in the US on this front, but it's still so hard for so many amongst us to accept, for example, that Trumpism was not a temporary aberration from a march forward, but is in fact our catastrophic state of affairs. It's really difficult to absorb the sobering truth of Spinoza's ontology. Reality is unregulated, it doesn't yield to human desires, it evades our most earnest attempts at controlling it. And this feels especially true at our pandemic juncture. Reflecting on these past years, what's striking in retrospect is the shock that most of us had when the coronavirus surfaced, the unbelievability that a pandemic could upend our entire lives. Despite repeated warnings from virologists the world over, bespeaks our attachment to anthropocentrism. As Spinoza has it, the delusion of human exceptionalism denudes us into sustaining ourselves as superior to nature. We perceive nature as inherently ordered, managed towards our benefit, and correlatively tameable by us humans who remain forever partial to it, only a part of it, but really apart from it. Now, while it's not groundbreaking to conceive that nature acts in ways incongruent with human expectations, the dogma of progress and the hubris of human sovereignty over nature account for both the initial disbelief in the severity of the virus and continued surprise at its refusal to yield to our attempts at controlling it. Indisputably, scientific interventions are responsible for constraining the spread of COVID and blunting its clinical severity. However, the continued optimism in the face of this crisis and the unsubstantiated certitude that it's soon to end reflect continued fidelity to the belief that nature is fundamentally ordered, or minimally, that nature is orderable by us, and that this pandemic is an exceptional circumstance, and that we humans are really still in control. These myths of sovereignty and human exceptionalism are so hard to shirk. Consider, for example, right, the initial hesitance to appreciate that the virus is airborne, the belief that the vaccine alone would stop this pandemic, the refusal to accept that even vaccinated people could contract and spread the virus, the continued assertion that natural immunity alone, or natural infection, confers immunity, the early denial of long COVID and its ongoing dismissal, the fallacious claim that it's not dangerous for children or even for healthy adults. Or how about the erroneous assertions that new variants would necessarily be less severe, as if the virus is interested in what's convenient for us humans, as if there's some law or regulatory mechanism commanding the virus to evolve in ways that most benefit us. I've lost count of the number of people who've told me, wait for it, you know what, I'm done with the pandemic. I've been careful for 2 years, I'm boosted, I've had enough, I'm over masks, I worked hard, I'm done. Surely we've all either heard this or felt this ourselves. But the sad truth is, as I've told many a friend, much to their consternation, the virus doesn't give a damn about you. It's entirely indifferent to all of your sacrifices and precautions heretofore. The virus isn't going to give you a gold star for effort and then be so considerate and avoid you. Nature is indifferent to our desires. The pandemic isn't over just because we've sovereignly decided that it's over. The virus doesn't bend to our dictates. There's no telos just there over the horizon. It's precisely our lack of control that conditions our conceits of control. Rather than concede that we have limited control, it's far more enticing to pretend that we're in control, to fabricate pacifying fictions of supremacy. Spinoza, what exists is the infinite connection of causes, a matrix of causes and effects that's infinite. It's limitless, without curbs, controls, or constraints. Modes of substance, everything that is, are inter and intraconnected. Causally determined, he tells us, in infinite ways, compelled to undergo many variations. What transpires, what exists, and how it exists are not the products of a transcendent plan or transcendent regulations, but rather causally determined in and as the infinite connection of causes in which we're all imbricated. There are no transcendent laws or norms in nature. By approaching reality as the immanent product of its infinite self, substance as self-caused, Spinoza refuses the transcendence and teleology attendant to notions that what exists is the product of an origin, a plan, or an overseer. Or, what is secured by regulations, governances, and ordinances. In the absence of these sovereignties, I suggest, it makes no sense to classify what modes are and how they are in terms of normativity and deviance or divergence. Since there's neither an originary state of being, nor an ordained modality of being, such notions do not obtain. Without a sovereign presiding over nature, without laws to command and control it, the modes that exist and how they behave do so beyond the constraints of the supposed normal and abnormal, ideal and non-ideal, regular and irregular, typical and atypical, natural and unnatural. There are no standards in nature. Nothing in reality is normative or not normative, both in so much as there's no big other supervising reality, nor are there ordinances governing it, and because such a formulation is but an anthropic fabrication. Normativity in nature is ontologically impossible, and its contrivance results from an epistemic misstep. Consider, for example, the convention of discerning bodily variations in reality and classifying them by sex, gender, race, and ability. It's not just that Spinoza's imminence renders the notion of a normative human mode untenable. His deconstruction of ostensibly neutral ideas about reality speaks to the persistence of sexist, racist, and ableist ideologies. To be clear, Spinoza does not address these specific ideologies. And in fact, his own views, as evidenced by passing remarks scattered through his writings, are at times decidedly sexist, racist, and ableist. Nevertheless, extending the critique of this appendix leads to conclusions that he couldn't have anticipated. We see, therefore, that all the notions by which ordinary people are accustomed to explain nature are only modes of imagining and do not indicate the nature of anything, only the constitution of imagination. Spinoza goes on and specifically names such notions as good and evil, order and confusion, beauty and ugliness. All of these Spinoza, building on Maimonides' critique of teleology and his guide to the perplexed, are human constructs that we thrust onto nature. Our interpretations of nature and the natural are entirely conditioned. The myth of normativity serves to organize a disparate reality by furnishing its contingent variations with sovereign purposiveness and meaning, so as to authorize and reauthorize hierarchies of domination, exploitation, and supremacy. To conclude, to accept this Spinoza's conception of reality as infinite and immanent is to dispense with the comforting fictions of control. While this may start with dethroning the sovereign God, this is only the beginning. Harder still is divesting from the prevalent reproduction of such sovereignty, its pervasive naturalization. Attuning ourselves to the alternative, non-Western tradition in which Spinoza participates pushes us to appreciate the ways in which the logics of sovereignty underwrite our approaches to reality. And crucially, It solicits us to consider dispensing with our constellated conceits of control. What might it mean to rethink the claim to human exceptionalism? Away with doctrines of order and ordinance in nature, normativity and norms. Admittedly, this isn't easy. After all, we fabricate these fictions of sovereignty precisely because we're really not sovereign at all. Our control over ourselves, not to mention reality, and often enough others, is severely truncated. The supremacies and hierarchies that we contrive as coping mechanisms may confer temporary relief, but these are not merely epistemically mistaken, they're ethically debilitating. What may yet be possible if we dispel these sovereignties? If we start admitting that reality, in fact, serves no purpose? All right, any questions? Any advocates of sovereignty and domination, exploitation? Come to the fore. So in that excerpt, right, he's providing us with a genealogy, right, a history of sorts of how did people come to believe in God or gods, right? So he's just saying that some people believe in God, some people believe in gods in the plural. They take our human construct of a ruler and thrust it onto nature. But that's not there. He's just describing how these ideas came to be, and not so much his own ideas, right? As for the notion that Spinoza is an atheist, well, that's just one of many instances where we have radically contradictory interpretations of Spinoza. For some, Spinoza is an atheist. To others, he's a God-intoxicated man. And everybody has their own Spinoza, but obviously my Spinoza is the right one. Obviously. Yes.
I wanted to ask about this, your Spinoza that you're reading, and it's very persuasive. You mentioned some relationship to non-Western tradition, and I wondered if your model of this radical and total dispelling of sovereignty, do you find it unique only to Spinoza, or do you find any comparison, or did he have any models in which he was really in dialogue, and not only you can see the dialogue, or is it very, very exceptional to his?
Okay, thank you. That's an important question. So on the one hand, let's say a bit more about these non-Western influences, right? So we want to be careful not to reduce Spinoza to that. But what I mean to suggest in that is that Spinoza is drawing from really this philosophical heritage that was systematically sidelined by Western Christian philosophy, and that's Islamic and Jewish philosophy, and specifically this tradition of a more naturalist or materialist interpretation of Aristotle, right? Specifically for Spinoza, that's, let's say, the notion of causal determinism. For everything that there's a cause, or even the way in which certain Jewish philosophers kind of chip away at certain transcendence that's accorded to God. And you see that specifically, let's say, in the attribution of free will to God. That's something that even somebody like Maimonides and other thinkers really kind of take away from God by rendering everything that God does as necessary, so depriving God of this kind of other faculty that wishes things and wills things. So those types of ideas, Spinoza really is getting from those sources, but I would say, you know, he takes it and runs with it. right? So these wouldn't necessarily agree with everything Spinoza says. And Spinoza certainly is very keen on telling us, let's say, that the mind does not control the body. Humans do not have free will. He also is very keen, obviously, in telling us that there's no sovereign control in nature, right? And of course, I take that in my reading of Spinoza as kind of the beginning steps in what I consider to be a larger assault on sovereignty, or specifically the logics of sovereignty, certain traits. So to give other examples, if traditionally God is considered to be one or a unity, that's a classic trait of sovereignty, right? A monarch is one and unified, over and above, beyond the law. Spinoza says, no, there is no sovereign control in nature that intercedes. There's no such thing as a miracle, and reality itself can't possibly be numerically one, for example. So those are maybe less interesting ways in which he disrupts sovereignty, but those are the ideas that I'm getting at. Does that answer the question? All right, a little bit. There's always more to discuss. And don't worry, folks on Zoom, we'll get to you soon enough. There's a hierarchy here.
Thanks for this. I have a quick question. I just noticed you said in the beginning you were talking about the webs or fictions of sovereignty that kind of just shoot through anthropocentrism turning into anthropomorphism, et cetera. And then before that, you also talked about reality being constituted by and interconnected, I guess, modes. I don't know. So there seems to be something really resonant or similar between these different systems. One, the true system in which the interconnections are right, and one that's false, where the interconnections are fictionalized and not conducive to living well. I'm just wondering what you think about the similarity of those structures, and if that false account is still kind of mimicking reality in a certain sense, and what that means for lies, or just how we find things persuasive, or just like what that connection kind of means.
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying. I think what you're asking is, well, on the one hand, you're telling us that everything is an infinite connection of causes. On the other hand, you're telling us that Spinoza really rejects certain ideas about, let's say, nature bending to our will. Or is that what you're saying? And wondering how to reconcile those? Or is there something else?
It just seems like the image that you get from his description of sovereignty has a similar structure, like of these interconnected things that are interconnected. With reality, it's still interconnected. It's not like,
right. I see. So the problem isn't. I see. The problem is when there's something taken to be transcendent to this interconnection, right? So if there's some plan or purpose that's other to reality and telling it what to do, that's the problem. Whereas to think about reality, all that exists as an infinite connection of causes, right, with no origin and no end, and no actually given boundaries between us, is to disrupt these types of already given sovereign boundaries, already given notions of sovereignty and control. Are there any online questions? Okay. Yes, we're rewarding those who came in person.
So thank you. This was awesome. I was thinking about the theological political treatise, right, is often taken as sort of an example of esoteric writing, you know, Leo Strauss, and maybe even sort of borrowing the techniques from Maimonides, Cat the Perplexed. There's contradictions, but intentionally so, and, you know, how do we get to the bottom of what Spinoza is actually trying to accomplish there? It's probably pragmatic and related to the political circumstances at the time, right? In your presentation, I'm just curious, you seem to be treating the ethics as relatively, you can take it at face value, and looking at what's explicit in the appendix. And I'm just curious if you think there's also, I don't know, if you subscribe to that notion of esoteric writing in the first place, and if there's anything like that going on in the ethics where he's saying something between the lines, or with the sort of axiomatic procedure that he uses,
Okay, so the question is really about Leo Strauss's claim of Spinoza writing the TTP, the Theological Political Treatise, esoterically, and we're now being asked, how does that fit in with the ethics? Without getting into all the details, there's a lot of disagreement in the scholarship, in the literature about the validity of Strauss's claim to begin with. Certainly the TTP is a political intervention, and he couldn't write straight out everything that he thought. But what's interesting about, and Spinoza actually tells us he wants to read scripture like he reads nature, right? Which means that we shouldn't approach scripture, or really any text, as having some hidden thing beneath it, or some telos to which it's bending. But in terms more broadly, I mean, Spinoza, like any writer of the time, and like any writer, we all try to figure out, what are we going to say explicitly? What are we going to only intimate? And Spinoza certainly does this with the tools that he has. God or substance or nature, right, is a really artful way of basically saying there's no God. Or other people would say, no, it's saying that there is a God and everything is God, or everything is of God. So I think Spinoza's explicit, right, that he's writing the ethics in a geometrical method, which is different than his tone in the TTP. But that's not to say that he isn't also polemical, as we saw today, especially in the appendices, prefaces, and the different scholia of the ethics. So I hope that addresses gestures towards some of your concerns. Ingrid, what have we got online?
So we have some great questions from Zoomland as well. So here's the first. Thanks for the lucid talk. Can you say more about Spinoza's responses to climate catastrophe, given his recognition of the limits of human agency and linear accounts of causation? What must humans do? Good question.
All right, excellent question, whoever there in Zoomland. So I'm not a climatologist, but I think there's more that can be said about the critique of teleology and anthropocentrism within the context of our climate emergencies. So the first is that to which we gesture towards, right? That this notion that the world centers on humans. And I would say I find that in a lot of the non-specialized conversation about climate change or global warming, there's this notion that we suddenly only care because it's really getting bad for us humans, right? It's actually been bad for other species for a long time, thanks to us, right? So there's this way in which we continue to center ourselves in the discourse. There's also this optimism that, you know, technology and advances, we can figure this out. We know how to make food even when the planet's on fire. So I would say Spinoza's telling us, maybe don't be so full of yourselves. And I would say maybe even more problematically, and this might be hard for some of us to swallow, what might it mean to accept the fact that there could be reality without humans, right? And that sounds really shocking to us, we're human, and also seems ethically horrible, but in the context of an infinite reality, who are we to crown ourselves supreme and suggest that reality couldn't exist without us, that we are the end or telos of reality, when in fact, I don't know, go ask the whales, what would they say? So I think that also helps us think about it. And I would also say on the flip side, right, there's also this teleological notion of an end awaiting us, right, in 2050, in 2080, and there's also a problem about that. What might it mean for life to look different? Or, so I think in all of these ways, and I would also add, speaking to that question about the infinite connection of causes, and the ways in which Spinoza reminds us we're not constitutionally other to nature or different from other species, is to recognize that we really aren't different from non-human animals. And what might that mean? And really any other mode. So what might that mean for us to accept that and act on that understanding? I hope that answered your question, person on Zoom.
Thank you. That was a great answer. I have another question here, and it appears to have multiple parts.
Oh,
so,
all right. We love those questions.
Oh, is it? Well, this looks like it. Okay, so if there is no normativity in the ethics, how do you understand what appears to be Spinoza's recommendation of certain affects and techniques to attain blessedness? Also, how do you understand blessedness, I guess? Wait. How do you understand, what appears to be a hierarchical relation between infinite and finite modes. So I can read
Okay.
that. Did you catch all
Yeah,
that?
I think I caught that.
Okay.
All right. So, well, I guess the question is being like, well, this is lovely. If Spinoza doesn't like teleology, what are we to say about parts 3, 4, and 5 of the Ethics, where he really does help us understand the affects? And I would say Spinoza isn't telling us, if you do exactly this, suddenly this will happen. What he's telling us is that actually we're not in control. The mind does not control the body, but there are certain behaviors or conditions we can do, right, that might potentially foster certain affects, and by extension foster certain ethical behaviors, right? So it's not like going to the doctor and getting a prescription, right? If you take this, then suddenly the pain will go away, right? He's actually being very honest and in some ways non-teleological, and also recognizing that actually our control is really truncated and very limited. And that speaks to that text we saw actually about how different Spinoza's approach to the affects is than that of Descartes and others, who he says don't really even address the affects because they really think humans can control themselves. And Spinoza's saying not at all, which is already very non-teleological compared to thinking you can really control yourself, your mind can control your body. As for blessedness, well, there's a lot of dispute in the scholarship about what exactly that means. I would say that for Spinoza, for whom everything is causal determinism, right, and there are causes and effects and causes, and he actually disrupts the hierarchy between causes and effects in terms of thinking about causation as intra-action and mutuality between cause and effect. There's this kind of perhaps consequence that might come from fostering certain behaviors or beliefs. And not necessarily that that's a goal in a teleological way, but a way of fostering, again, certain behaviors. As for the difference between finite modes and infinite modes, yeah, there's already Hegel tells us, and actually even before that, everyone's like, well, what's the deal with Spinoza? He says there are finite modes, but there are infinite modes. That seems to suggest that there's a hierarchy. I'm aligned with those readers of Spinoza who don't think that that's the case, and the same would actually go with infinite attributes, that there's kind of this coincidence of substance and its attributes, and that the way that substance exists is its actions, and its actions are modes. And that is to disrupt a certain hierarchy that others might erect in terms of finite and infinite modes. But I think that's enough, so as we don't go into too much minutia. Any other questions? All right.
Okay. Let me see. So this is regarding the climate emergency. Does Spinoza's rejection of transcendence absolve humans of ethical responsibility? That is to say, if everything we do is part of nature, can we really do anything wrong? And I think you may have sort of addressed this earlier.
Yeah, definitely for a book called The Ethics. Spinoza's keen on ethics, on ethical behavior. The problem is that we think we are fully in control again of what we do and what we say. And so that's the difference. Spinoza absolutely wants us to behave ethically, but that's different. The difference is that he doesn't think we can just decide to behave ethically and then suddenly we can. We can't command ourselves like a sovereign. And so the question is, what behaviors are we fostering? What communities are we building that might be more conducive to certain ethical behaviors? But there was this, is there something I'm missing in the question? What was the, okay, no, I think I got it. Okay. Was there a final question? Not to be teleological about it.
Not to be teleological.
And finalist. But any other questions?
I think there's one more here. Would you please comment on the similarities and differences between Spinoza's ethics and Stoicism? Are there respects in which, say, Epictetus lays the foundation for, or at any rate shares common views with Epictetus? Okay, I think that question hopefully makes some sense. Yeah?
Yeah, I would say that is a beautiful example of precisely what is sometimes really problematic in the scholarship, where Spinoza is always compared over and against a very specific canon that's seen as informing him. And there are certainly many, not many, some have written about the Stoicism maybe alignments or misalignments with Spinoza, but I would say I'm going to hold off on responding because I find the question problematic. And I'm the sovereign here. All right, is that it?
I think it might be.
All right, well, thank you everyone in person and on Zoom.
Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. Kletenik. That was really engaging, and I got to say, rather invigorating.